Hi, welcome to my presentation. Hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe. Um, it's kind of a weird way to do the presentation, but thankful that we have the technology to be able to do it anyway. Yeah, my presentation is about adoption and what that's looking like in today's world, especially with the economy the way it is, and yeah, how we as Christians are called to adoption. So let's get started. So my thesis is that adoption is a vital part of our calling as Christians. Every Christian is called to support and understand adoption in some form. So we'll unpack this a little bit more as we go, but yeah, my entire presentation is basically based around the fact that there's no way around it. Christians are called to adoption, and yeah, we're called to be in all areas of it. So we'll get more into that as we go. So the four coordinates are religious orientation, creational structure, creational development, and contemporary response. These four coordinates, I think, are going to help us to answer some questions. If you were to read my paper, you'd kind of understand those questions a little bit more. But basically, those questions are, what must Christians do about adoption? Secondly, how are we called to participate in adoption? And arguably the most important question that we have to answer is, how can we get the world to follow this call? So we as Christians know our call, but what is the call that we can help the world to see in adoption? So let's get started with the first of the four coordinates, religious orientation. So I found four scripture passages here that I think do a really good job of just diving into a different area of adoption. Each of them yeah, just kind of proves a different part of why Christians are called to adoption. So I'm going to read each verse, and then I'm also going to read just a short part from my paper that kind of describes what each verse is talking about as it pertains to adoption. So the first one here is Deuteronomy 10, verse 18. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigners residing among you. Give them food and clothing. So this verse, I think it really does a good job of showing how God not only loves all, but God fights for those who struggle. So those who struggle, God doesn't push them aside like we might. He fights for them. He loves those who have loss in their life, and he will defend them for those who want to try to break them down. Defend them from those who want to try to break them down, sorry. The second verse is Isaiah 40, verse 31, a fairly well-known verse that I'm sure you've all heard. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not grow faint. Adoption and the journey that leads through adoption can be brutal. I have yet to meet an adoptive parent who said that their process was easy, nor have I met a birth parent who did not feel weary at some point. It takes incredible strength on both sides to take on the adoption journey. But yet God is calling us in this verse to take on that journey willingly and to just jump right in. So the third verse here is James 1, verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This verse is a call to Christians to take on the mission of making sure every child is taken care of and part of a family. This may look like adoption, foster care, or financially supporting ministries that do such work. And the last verse is Psalm 65, verse 5 to 6. A father to the fatherless, a defender of the widow, is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. If you look at how humans interact with each other, we tend to need community at our core. We long to be a part of something, and typically a part of a family. Whether these families are self-formed or biological, God meant us to interact with one another in family form. This may look like a group of friends, an adoptive family, a foster family, or a traditional family setting. Regardless, God makes it known that adoption and family in many forms is central to what he desires for us. So moving on then to creational structure. This is an important thing to consider when we look at our call towards adoption, is where the world is at right now. Obviously right now, this presentation would have looked a little different a few months ago, but with coronavirus and COVID-19, however you want to call it, raging all over the world, especially now in North America, that's come in the last month or so. Coronavirus is not helping the number of adoptions that are happening worldwide. As you probably know, there's thousands of people who have been laid off all over the world. And as a result of that, people aren't making the same amounts of money as they were before. And something you may not have been aware of, or you may have been aware of, is that adoption costs a lot of money. Especially international adoption, but even local adoption as well, costs a lot of money. And the problem with that is that right now the government is looking to save money. They're looking to cut costs because they have to care for a lot of these people who now do not have jobs. And so with the government over here trying to decrease funding to different places, and adoption right now is needing increased funding, there's a huge imbalance there between these two. And so basically what we need to do is look for ways that we can increase the number of adoptions by not using as much money, which kind of seems like it wouldn't fit and it doesn't work. But after doing a fair amount of research, I have found a study, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence to support this, that there is ways to go and get around this and to boost the number of adoptions by decreasing the amount of funding that's needed. So this study, it's entitled right here, Adoption for Foster Care, Aiding Children While Saving Public Money. This is a study done by a guy in Washington, D.C., and this study shows how the government can cut costs while still boosting the number of adoptions. Basically, to summarize the study for you, he was saying that the best way to boost the number of adoptions is to have more people in America adopt kids out of the foster care system. So kids, thousands of kids all the time are being adopted into America, but there's so many kids who are also in the foster care system. And this system has a lot of bureaucratic red tape that makes it hard for kids to get out of this system. Often relatives have custody before they're even allowed to go for adoption. But what he's saying is that if we can increase the amount of kids being adopted out of the foster care system, we will be able to decrease the amount of public funding that has to go to foster care and increase the amount of kids that will get to go to their forever home, which is a huge advantage as well. So transitioning more kids out of foster care through adoption is kind of the answer to helping adoption in the current economy. There's a study done of teens in the Midwest, and this is kind of an interesting study because I feel like it's fairly relevant for people around Dort because it's done in the Midwest. So this sample of young adults ages 23 and 24 aged out of foster care, they had extremely high rates of arrest and incarceration. But 81% of long-term foster care males had been arrested at some point, and 59% had been convicted of at least one crime. This compares to only 17% of all young men in the U.S. who have been arrested, and 10% of those had been convicted of a crime. So you can see the numbers of kids who got out of the foster care system versus kids who never spent any time in the foster care system. The numbers of who was incarcerated and who was convicted of crimes was just so different. There was such a mismatch there. And I'm not bashing the foster care system at all, but the unstable environment that the foster care system tends to create is often a leading cause in the amount of incarcerations that happen later on in these kids' lives. And so because of that, the answer is often to get them adopted so that they can have a forever home, that they don't have to have this instability in their life. So there's another study that I found that shows that children who are adopted are more likely to have, and then it has a bunch of different things that they're more likely to have than children who spend their time in the foster care system. So just to highlight a few, it says children are more likely, who are adopted are more likely to be living with a mother and father who are legally married. They are twice as likely to have at least one parent who graduated college, and they're 3 times as likely to be living in a financially secure household, and they're more likely to be living in a safe, supportive neighborhood. So that just shows you, again, some of the serious advantages to having kids adopted rather than put into foster care. So we're going to move into creational development now. A lot of the problem with funding of adoption is that there's not a lot of funding to be had in this area. And a lot of the funding is going to places like Planned Parenthood. So you can see these companies here. I'm sure all of you I've supported a lot of these companies, I know. But these companies support Planned Parenthood fairly religiously. And I think that as we go out and we start our own businesses or get higher up and involved in different businesses, we have to be the ones who are starting to change the way that our businesses that we're involved in support. So Planned Parenthood, I think you all know, performs a lot of abortions, and we can't have that if we want to support adoption. It's in direct conflict with adoption. And so companies like Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption is a great place to go support. Their mission statement is finding forever families for children in foster care. So they want to take kids out of foster care and place them into adoption and get them a forever home. And that's exactly what the study that I found suggesting people do. And so those kind of organizations are the ones that we need Christians to be supporting in these times, not Planned Parenthood. So moving into our last category then is contemporary response. I believe that it's important to consider that God has given us 2 callings on this earth. Transcends this presentation, is bigger than just adoption or anything like that. God has given us 2 callings. The first calling is to follow God. He calls us to do that many times in the Bible. The second calling is to do what he says. Adoption fits into both of those callings. There's no conflict in adoption, trying to adopt. You can be conflicted with the calling that God's given you with adoption. It's in direct correlation with what he calls us to do. I believe that every Christian is called to adoption. However, that doesn't mean that every Christian is called to adopt. It's important to understand that not everyone's called to adopt a child or even foster a child. You can emotionally, financially, morally support the people who are adopting and are going out and bringing these children into their homes. An interesting study that I found is that 100,000 kids are waiting to be adopted in the U.S. right now. And there are currently, as we speak, 300,000 churches in the U.S. at this point in time. Which means that if 1/3 of the churches in America decided that they would find one family in their church to adopt a child, we would not have very many kids in the United States waiting to be adopted anymore. We would just bring all those kids back to places where they can have a home forever. And so the call to us and to the world is pretty simple. The call is to go, to help, and to get involved. There's plenty of ways you can do this in your local community. You just have to look, and it's important to understand that it's not the same call for everyone. Adoption and the calling towards adoption is not going to look the same for me as it is for you, but we're called to it nonetheless. And so it's important to understand that there's no excuses. We're all called to adoption. God wants us to feed the orphan, clothe the orphan, and adoption is a direct way to do that. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Please enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe, stay healthy.